Friends, let us continue our discussion about what Aristotle has talked about, has discussed about astonishment and irrational. And we have seen that how Aristotle goes on to say that irrationality generates astonishment, and astonishment gives pleasure. And the implication is that it is legitimate for epic to exploit its greater tolerance to greater tolerance of irrational. These two concessions have something in common. Irrationalities can be included in parts of the action which lie outside of a play. And in epic, it is outside of the action. Now, in both the cases, whether it is play, whether it is epic, in both the cases, the irrationality cannot be seen by audience. Keeping an irrationality out of the sight of the audience, which makes it less salient and also helps us to keep intact the impression that everything is probably connected with each other. In the next part of chapter 24, Aristotle discusses about Homer's idea of irrationality, how Homer used irrationality. The last part of chapter 24, which says that Homer taught other poets the right to tell falsehoods. It suggests a further way to smuggle an and my friends, that it is the way that Homer is trying to bring this. Because if you want to give an impression that all the things are making sense of connectivity with each other, if this impression that everything makes a sense, we need to have a kind of irrationality to be allowed, which needs to be out of the sight of the audiences. This is what Aristotle talked about, pointed out of Homer's approach. Now, this is simply to exploit human tendency to make fallacious inferences when we speak. For example, if you can take even Aristotle has given this explanation and suggest a fallacy of the kind, such as if Daisy is a cow, then Daisy has four legs. Daisy has four legs, so Daisy is a cow. This is absolutely a fallacious inferences that you will find out. But you need to have these fallacious inferences for the continuity of the action and connectedness that an audience is expected to find in any tragedy or in any epic. Now, if one is not alert and critical, because the audience of a play or an epic recited is likely to expect that the events in the play or in the epics will be connected. It is what he is simply expecting, and he may not have any, you can say, frame of mind that whenever he will watch a play or whenever he will see the epic recitation, he has to solve a jigsaw puzzle of events. If there is a jigsaw puzzle of events in a play or in an epic, then it will be difficult for the audience to find out the connectivity into it, and it may lose the audience's concentration to look at that particular plot. So it is essential that there may be certain fallacious inferences, and those fallacies may be unnoticed because you cannot find out the fallacy. And the poet will then, you will find out, have persuaded the audience by uh, subterfuge that something is necessary or probable when it is not necessary and probable. This is what the poet can create, either in tragedy or in epic. Later on, in the same chapter, Aristotle is pointing out about very interesting thing. And he pointed out that being a reader, we should prefer probable impossibilities to implausible possibilities. We should prefer, when you watch a tragedy, when you see the recitation of epic, we should prefer, what we should prefer as an audience, we should prefer the probable impossibilities to plausible possibilities. Implausible possibilities. Now, why this one should prefer? Because Again, the emphasis is on maintaining the impression of connectedness. As I said to you that audience is not at all interested in solving the jigsaw puzzles. If any plot is appearing in that format, whether it is in tragedy, whether it is in epic, the audiences are not in the frame of mind to solve this puzzle that you are putting in front of them. So they are expecting that there should be connectedness. There should be connectedness in the events. The events should be connected with each other. And the connectedness of event, something that is in reality necessary or probable, but which looks as if it is not damaging that impression. And if it is damaging that impression, it should be avoided. Because as I said that we have to create an impression of connectedness. And this is how you will find out, my friends, that the playwright or the poet is trying to create this, is trying to meet out this particular idea of connectedness by any means, improbable possibilities, uh, probable impossibilities, or implausible possibilities. We have to understand something which is not necessary or probable, but which looks as if it is mentioning the impression, but it is mentioning the impression. It is not possible. Probability or necessity, which is not, you will find out probability and necessity are not essential here, not possible here, but you have to maintain this impression that there is a probability and necessity because it is a technically superior thing. And that's why we need to understand this very important trick that a playwright or a poet has to perform when he is writing an epic, reciting an epic, because he need to carry certain irrationalities into his sayings. So you cannot say that there is no irrationality, any sort of irrationality in any of the plot. Yes, there is irrationality. There is absolute some kind of irrationality is there, but that is not visible to the audience. Now here, a preference for having no irrationality is combined with willingness. It is combined with the willingness to tolerate these irrationalities. It is again that the poet should understand that there is a willingness of tolerating these irrationalities are part of the audience's understanding. So if he or she brings out certain irrationalities, discusses, takes certain irrationalities with them, in that sense, we need to understand that audiences are almost willing to do it. Now, near the end of chapter number 24, Aristotle seems to suggest certain ways to conceal irrationalities. What he says that you may distract, you may distract attention from the irrationalities by uh, your skill and brilliance of writing. You can hide those things as Homer conceals the absurdity involved in the narration of Odysseus. He concealed the absurdities because Odysseus' wandering carries certain absurd elements into it. And it was the skill of Homer that he had concealed those absurdities with the good qualities that he has projected of Odyssey. So there are irrationalities, there are absurdities, and if there is a sort of thing like this, it totally or it is dependent on the skill of that writer, how he will conceal this thing, how he will hide this thing, how he will not show these things to his audience. And this is how Aristotle has showed another way to hide irrationalities. Now, we may have a small query or question in our mind that why irrationalities have been hammered so much in chapter number 24 by Aristotle, why he is continuously insisting that there should be irrationalities. What are the reasons that he is insisting about irrationalities? Why we want, why we require? Friends, as we have already discussed, we have already pointed out certain elements. The depiction of or imitation of a person of real life into the poetry makes the poetry to get close to the audience's understanding. Don't we find that we most of the time carries certain irrationalities in our life also? We are not almost 100% rational. There are irrationalities, but all the irrationalities are not exposed. All the irrationalities are not appearing in front of us. Or if we did something irrational, we hide it, we conceal it. And Aristotle is saying the same thing, that when you are trying to bring all those things into an epic, because epic is nothing but a heroic expression of an ideal person of the society. And if it is about heroic personality, then irrationalities of those heroic personalities are not being appreciated in society. So you need to understand how to hide these irrationalities. And with your good writing skills, you can hide those irrationalities. By showing the good qualities at higher side, you can hide the irrationalities of that particular character. And Aristotle gives example of Homer's Odyssey. Now, why Aristotle prefers the avoidance of irrationalities? What will happen if it is shown on the stage, if it is recited in an epic? What happened? Why he is so much insisting, why he is preferring to avoid the irrationalities? Is he willing to tolerate them? And chapter number 25 answers this question. Chapter number 25 answers this question, and it suggests, if impossibilities have been included in a poem, then it is an error. Please understand this. If impossibilities have been included in a poem, that is an error, but it is correct if it attains the end of the art itself. That is, if it makes either recognizes that irrationality can enhance the effect of the poem, provided it should be concealed. In such cases, Aristotle does not have any sort of objection. Please understand, if the impossibilities have been directly shown into the poem, it is an error according to Aristotle. But if it is the requirement that you want to have impossibilities as part of your poem, part of your play, part of your tragedy, part of your epic, in these cases, it should attain the end of the art itself. That means if it is required to have some greater impact, it is taking the art to a superior level. If it is enhancing the effect of poem, Aristotle says that you need to conceal it, you need to hide it. And if this is the thing, then he is not having any objection for this. A poet who is designing a plot, he should aim, or even you can say, should bring other things at an equal level. A consistency, a consistency with what is necessary or probable. But when, but where the poet's emotional impact can be increased, where it is to be increased and how it is to be increased. But where the poem's emotional impact can be increased by departure from necessity or probability, then in these cases, that departure is legitimate. What is an ultimate aim? Ultimate aim is to have an impact, emotional impact of the poem on the audience. If there is a proper emotional impact on the audience, and you need to take a departure from necessity and probability, because necessity and probability, as Aristotle said it right from the beginning, and I said it, he used this phrase continuously. When this probability or necessity, when he used this phrase continuously, he said that for increasing of emotional impact with the help of probability and necessity, if it is essential, you have to do it, it has to take place. But if you are taking departure from necessity and probability, and even if you feel that this departure can create a sort of emotional impact that is expected out of this poetry, then this departure is also legitimate. Otherwise, he has not allowed you to take departure from this necessity or probability. You have to take it as a part of your, it is essential as a part of your understanding. Now, necessary and probable, this connection is desirable in general, but not for any abstract priori reason. It is essential, it is desirable, not for any abstract or priori reason, but because in practice it generally serves to increase the impact of events. Necessary, and probability in general increase the impact of the events, and that's why necessary and probable connection is desirable. It is desirable for any abstract, before giving any reason to that abstract, before giving prior reason to the abstract. It is essential, necessary and probability. So one should always retain the impression of necessary or probable connection by distracting from, or you can say concealing in one way or another, the irrationality. Because if you use irrationalities, there is a less chance of using necessity and probability. But you should retain the impression in front of the audience. Although you used irrationality there, you should retain the impression that it is a part of necessity and probability. Because sometimes a false impression will be more effective than the real thing. And it is a very common understanding in any of the societies that if some false is said for achieving something good, then this false is not to be considered as false. If you are saying some lie, if this lie is helping other to achieve something in his life, then this lie is not to be considered as a sin. This is a very common understanding in the society, and Aristotle, that's why saying that if you want to achieve effect, then sometimes a false impression will be more effective than the real things, and that's why you have to use irrationality. If you're using irrationality, necessity and probability may lose its part in connecting the events, connecting the things. And Aristotle is trying to say that irrationalities are accepted if they are concealed. The chapter number 25, from which this point has been taken, is concerned with objections which people raised about poems, and with the range of possible responses and solutions to those objections. Now, the principle it enunciates can be applied to any poetic forms. Some examples Aristotle has taken it from tragedy also. It has mentioned while he's talking about epic, he has taken certain examples from tragedy also to mention that this objections which people raise and the possible responses about necessary and probability and concealing their rationalities. The whole discussion in this which we are now continuing from couple of days, the discussion is attached to the section on epic because the critique of implausible, inconsistent, and immoral elements in poetry had been comprehensively applied to Homer's book 2 and 3, to Homer, and you will find out he's applied it to Homer. Or Plato's Republic. Plato's Republic collect such type of material, and Plato collected material, and the 4th century sophist Zolius, who earned the nickname called Homer, Homer's scourge, for his 9 books devoted to identifying the faults of Homer's poem. Look out how seriously the people worked. Zoilus has written 9 books finding the faults in Homer's poetry by the title Homer's Scourge, Scourge. And Plato collected this Zoilus's references in his Republic, saying that poets are bringing irrationalities and implausible things in the society. Aristotle collected such problems in his 6 books by the title Homeric Problems. He wrote a book called Homeric Problems where he collected all these issues mentioned by Zoilus, who is the source for Plato's objection against poets. Aristotle collected those objections in 6 books titled Homer's Problem and discusses such passages. This chapter number 25 of Poetics offers an extremely condensed synopsis of this material that he has collected in 6 books. All the things he wrote in 6 books under the title Homeric Problems, he has collected, he has condensed those material, those objections, and brings out all those things in a condensed synopsis form in chapter number 25. And that's why it is correspondingly difficult for most of the critics and editors to interpret and analyze this chapter number 25. Please remember this thing categorically, my friends, that chapter number 25 is a condensed version of the material that Aristotle has collected and wrote a book called Homeric Problems in 6 books. That's why this is a condensed, and that's why it is difficult to understand. Rather than to pursue all the details, it may be more helpful to look at the general principles which Aristotle states and consider how they fit in with the rest of the theory articulated in Poetics. He has taken certain, we have to take certain things from these and to apply to other forms of poetics, apply to the theory of poetics that Aristotle has propounded. From chapter number 25, because it is difficult to analyze as a condensed version of his 6 books of Homeric problems. So we have to pursue, instead of going with the detail, we have to look at general principles that Aristotle has brought out. There are 3 principles Aristotle has brought out. 3 principles, 3 general principles. The first, it is based on the object of poetic imitation. First, it is based on the object of poetic imitation. Poetry is not to bound, is not bound to imitate what is the case, but it can imitate what ought to be case or is said to be the case. Please understand this. Aristotle suggests 3 principles. Why he is suggesting this 3 principle? Because the sophist Zoilus, Zoilus, has wrote 9 books finding out the faults in Homer's poetry. And Plato has taken this material in his book called Republic, book number 2 and 3. So to answer or to find out answer to such problems, Aristotle discussed it by writing 6 books called Homeric Problem to counter Zoilus' faults. And in chapter number 25 of Poetics, he used these 6 books in a condensed form, condensed material. And that's why it is difficult to understand. But looking into the things in general, instead of going into detail that what these 6 books discuss about, we will deviate from the discussion of Poetics. So We have to look certain general principles that Aristotle discussed into this. So Aristotle discussed three principles. First principle is based on the object of poetic imitation. And poetry, which is not bound to imitate what is the case, it is not imitating the thing as it is, but it can imitate what ought to be the case or what is to be said as a case. Now, this looks like a little bit similar of the things that we discussed in chapter number 9, that the poet is not tied to the real events. He will not imitate the real events into his poetry, but he can use to invent plots out of these real events. And then the discussion moved to history and biography. Even we discussed it in a couple of lectures back. But the latter passages, but this, that poet is not tied down to real events but can use it to invent plots as well. Now, if you see, what is more radical is its implications. Suppose a poet constructs a plot in which a god inflicts terrible punishment on a human being who has offended him. Now, is that necessary or probable? Is that necessary or probable that God should punish because the human being has offended God? In reality, no philosopher will tell us that this is not a true conception of divinity. No philosopher will tell us that this is not a true conception of divinity. But in terms of traditional Greek religious beliefs, that is what is generally is said to be the case about the way the God behaves. The God's action is certainly necessary or probable. That is a general Greek belief that God's action is certainly necessary or probable if the human being had committed any mistake. But a philosopher will not say this is not a case of divinity. Divinity will not punish, he will forgive. That is what philosophers used to say. That God will not punish, God will forgive. Punishing for misdeed is the behavior of human. And that's why it's a Greek belief that yes, God can certainly take any action. This is necessary or probably. Probably he will take or not. Necessary or probable. So the plot of a poem does not have to conform to the underlying universal patterns. It has nothing to follow this universal pattern in his imaginary or in his fictional world. Why he should follow the things that happens in real life in his fictional world? He may change, he may not change. As a traditional religious belief used to point out. He may use or he may not use. And that's why there's a choice for the poet, that what sort of object he will choose for his imitation. Please understand what how it is going on. It is going on with the reference to the faults that Zoilus had found in Homer's poetry, and Aristotle is simply answering all those things because Plato has used Zoilus to and quoted Zoilus in his Republic. This is the first principle, that what is the object? That is his choice. Homer has chosen in his fictional world that how his God will behave. He has decided in his fictional world. Now it is not you can use it as a general universal principle. No, it is not a general universal principle. This is what the first general principle Aristotle is talking about. Aristotle's second general principle is based on the medium of poetic imitation, that is language. Medium of poetic imitation. Please remember, these things we have discussed in detail at the beginning of Poetics, but now it comes as a reference to the queries and questions and faults that Zoilus has used in pointing out in Homer's poetry, and Plato has used it. Aristotle wrote 6 books to answer this, of which a condensed material is been part of this chapter number 25, and that's why chapter number 25, for understanding, we are using that. There are certain general principles Aristotle discussed, and there are 3 general principles. First is what are the object that poet should imitate. The second thing is that medium of poetic imitation, that is language. We know from the discussion of poetic styles in chapter number 21, 22, that poetry is distinguished by departures from standard speech. It should not carry standard speech in its writing. It should have a departure from the standard speech. And such departures can be used for answering the objections if it can be argued that objector has misunderstood one of the non-standard usages of the characteristics of poetic diction. If there is a standard norms of language used in poetry, then you are going to find out the faults into it, because standard norms of language have a scientific way to write, and this will create a sort of give a chance to most of the critiques to find out the faults into writing it. And that's why he said it should be a departure from standard norms of writing, standard norms of using language. If somebody creates a objection, if somebody is objecting this type of language, that what type of language is used, then there is a chance for the poet to say that it is commonly misunderstood, that this is a non standard usage of poetic diction. It is a characteristic of poetic diction that it uses non standard forms of language. And that's why the second principle is about language. It should deviate, it should take a departure from standard usage. The third general principle, Aristotle insists on the discussion on the distinction between standard, by which poetry and the products of other techne are to be judged. Hope that you remember techne. Yet There should be distinction between the standard forms of poetry and other products of technique, painting and all those things. Now, this principle, of course, applies to other arts also. If I am illustrating a zoology textbook, I ought to get the details of an animal's anatomy right and exact. I cannot say that this is what I think. No, right and exact anatomy of the animal. And I have to resist myself in the temptation to draw an imaginary beast. No, I cannot do that. If I'm painting pictures to hand in art gallery, I can legitimately sacrifice the strict zoological accuracy in the interest of the painting for its balance and composition. And dragons and unicorns can be more picturesque than the war togs. So the third thing is what Aristotle is talking about. The third principle is that you have to understand the distinction between the standard thing and technique. These are the three principles that Aristotle discussed in chapter number 25. The rest of the things that Aristotle talked about epic, because this is supposed to be what we are going to discuss it in tomorrow's lecture, supposed to be the last chapter of Poetics, or you can say the only last part that is survived, which raises the question of whether epic or tragedy, what is this, which one is superior. And then Aristotle moves to the last part of comedy, a one page discussion of comedy. So till Friday, we are going to conclude the Poetics, the last chapter of Poetics. And on Saturday, we'll have a test on the defined text.